I know, the rules they're what they are.
Put my password in every time.
Our password is their Deborah Ross.
Teresa's not here yet.
Teresa's not here.
I just saw Amelia.
Oh, she is?
Amelia's here. She's right there.
Yeah, I just saw Amelia.
Oh, she's right there. See, when I stand by you,
I
it
have a
turns into
committee
purple.
meeting where I'm the ranking member that starts at 10. So
I'm going to
scoot.
let's get Amelia over here. There's Teresa. Okay, and everybody, here's the run of show. I introduce Gwen. Gwen introduces you. Teresa. Teresa introduces Ross. Ross introduced Costa. You introduce Amelia. Okay. I don't know why I've got last name.
Who's pretending to be the...
I'm going to just say point blank, she'll be at the round table this afternoon. She was supposed to be here. And
I'm going to talk in a very bipartisan way.
good morning, everybody. We are very grateful, all of us, to be here with a bipartisan group of colleagues. Now, you might be looking at us and saying, where is she? Congressman Kim is supposed to be here. She will be joining us for the round table this afternoon.
Are the mics on?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, so how do we turn them on? Staff?
I don't think they're on.
He said he can hear
I don't think
you.
there's any amplification.
Okay, we just got to talk. So I have a big mouth. Anyway, we want to thank everybody for being here with us today, and we are a very bipartisan group, because the fact of the matter is domestic violence transcends politics, geographic, racial, and I'm going to remind people, socioeconomic lines. It's an issue that impacts all of us, and that we all have to be working on together. We've got to rip the stigma off of people being embarrassed to talk about it, and we've got to do more to help people who need that helping hand. No person should stay in a situation where they're trapped in violence, and I'm going to remind everybody, as the child of someone, therefore someone who lived in it, children shouldn't be kept in those situations. Domestic violence can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and it's critical that we have programs in place to serve survivors both in the short term and the long term. Victim service organizations play a critical role in ensuring that survivors and their families have access to the resources they need. It is not an exaggeration to say that they save lives every single day. The services that they provide are essential support for survivors and their families. But I'll tell you something else. It makes communities healthier, safer, and more prosperous. I know. I'm someone who lived it. I talk about it. I hate it. Never know quite what I'm going to say. But to this day, I'll never forget taking a gun, getting in the middle of a gun between my father and my mother, keeping my father from killing my mother, and hiding in closets, praying to God, please let us live. Please let us live. And by the way, calling the police when it was really bad and nobody coming. Being trapped in a house where the doorknobs were taken off every door. Being left by a mother who loved us, but she escaped for her life. And being trapped in a situation where you know you're going to die and there's nobody to help you. That's not okay in America, and it should never, ever, ever happen again. You know, don't you? So, while we've made great progress in breaking down this stigma, thank you, Jim, and providing survivors with the support that they need, there's so much more work that needs to be done, especially with what's happening now with the Trump administration. For months, service providers, I'm meeting with them, where all of us are meeting with them. They're struggling. The service groups, these groups that help people, have gotten no clarity from the administration of what's going to happen on their grants that they've consistently relied on and we have authorized, and how they will be affected by funding cuts and executive orders that dilute the nature of their mission. We sent letters alongside my colleagues with Rep. Moore and others to HHS and the Department of Justice, seeking further clarity on their plans for victim service grants they oversee, and urging them to oppose cuts and force reductions. The most vulnerable people too often fall under the radar and are disproportionately impacted by these cuts. And that's why it's so important that we continue to uplift and tell the stories of survivors and shine a light on the need to protect federal funding for domestic sexual assault services, violence, and prevention. And I'm going to give you an example. I've worked for 20 years. Detroit, the city of Detroit itself, does not have a domestic violence shelter. We got it done. We got the money raised to finally build that shelter, and it's delayed by a year. because the people that are going to run it don't know whether they're going to get the grants that they thought that they would be able to get. So another year in a major urban city without that shelter that they should have. And now let me introduce my partner in working in all of this, a very strong, feisty, never backs down woman, and another Midwesterner, my colleague, Congresswoman Gwen Moore.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie, for that story.
Thank you, Debbie.
Your life committed.
It is just so triggering. I mean, surviving violence, domestic violence, is the trauma of that is never over. And we thank you, Debbie, for subjecting yourself to those memories again. You know, I too have had a gun put to my head, and so I know what it's like to fear for my life. And sadly, I am not an unusual case. 4.5 million women live today who can report that an intimate partner used a gun to threaten them. And as a member of Congress, I have made a commitment to stand up for the survivors who need services, including culturally competent services and emergency services. Unfortunately, not all people who are subjected to domestic violence are just Democrats or just black women, but they are all women, and Republicans too. This is why this has been traditionally a bipartisan issue. Since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, the federal government has acknowledged that domestic violence is not just a little private matter to be settled in the home, but a public health issue. Preventing domestic violence it happens, as I said, in red states, blue states, purple counties, blue states, everywhere. And right now, you know, we're dealing with an uptick in domestic violence after it had gone down. And we see this. Cases from the pandemic when actually it was not safer to stay at home. Domestic violence reports increased from 21% to 35%. That's a big jump. And now this administration, filled with men who are desensitized to this issue because of their own domestic violence record, chooses to turn its back on survivors. And we know that should this bill, this big, ugly bill, go through, and all of the cuts that are proposed with SNAP and Medicaid and even Medicare are imposed, that we will see it reflected in yet another increase in domestic violence. You know, we've also seen this administration fire experts with decades of experience in preventing domestic violence. Domestic violence organizations are losing opportunities like the one that Debbie described, where they can't even open their doors because they don't know what their fate is with regard to receiving grant funding. They're clawing back the funding. The Trump budget calls to eliminate the Center for Disease Control Injury Center altogether, which would cut critical violence prevention programs, and of course cutting all the programs that are supported through the Office on Violence Against Women. I guess this is because the Violence Against Women, once its very first author was Joe Biden, and this is part of the retribution tour. But we don't need retribution against American women. The proposed budget comes at a time when our programs are stretched thin, According to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, in just one day that they took a census in 2023, a census, 77,000 victims received services in 2023. On one day, 77,000 folks were served. And then more than 13,000 requests for services went unmet because of the lack of resources. So even at the current funding levels, there's a dearth of funding. And that's why this day, this Domestic Violence Day of Action has been called, to call attention to this chaos, to this uncertainty, to this unfairness, to this lack of empathy, and the agony that is inflicting on survivors. As Representative Dingell has pointed out, and I won't prolong this, we've worked hard. This group here, we've sent letters to the administration. We've pushed for answers. We have concerned about the nexus of gun violence. You see, one of our members with domestic violence. The Delta grants are eviscerated. And these are the only federal funds dedicated to the primary prevention of domestic violence and sexual-based violence. This reorganization has disorganized and dismantled services for the most vulnerable. And as Ms. Dingell has pointed out, it's not just women who die every day from domestic violence, it's our children too. I'm going to yield the mic now to someone who's an extremely consistent supporter of ending domestic violence, and someone who has really expanded her footprint for protecting women by becoming the chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus, and that's Teresa Lugar Fernandez. Please take the mic.
Oh, thank you, darling. Buenos dias, good morning. I am Teresa Lugar Fernandez, representing a beautifully diverse 3rd Congressional District of Nuevo Mexico, and serve as the chair, along with many of my colleagues, my hermanas behind me, who are on the executive committee of the Democratic Women's Caucus. And we are very concerned, and we join this bipartisan effort to end domestic violence. Because we know that domestic violence knows no boundary, it knows no party, it just knows pain. It just knows suffering. It knows anger. It knows cries of anguish. And it knows wounds that sometimes lead to advocacy and championing, and sometimes don't. Not everybody can emerge from the horror and the nightmare and turn into a Debbie Dingell. There are so many more women who suffer with those scars, who cannot get back up, who cannot pay the rent, who cannot escape the scourge of domestic violence. And it is indeed a bipartisan scourge. In New Mexico, more than half of women have been sexually assaulted or raped at some time in their lives. In Oklahoma, my neighbor state, slightly more Republican than our slightly more Democrat New Mexico, beautiful state. 51.5% of Oklahoma women, and indeed many men, will experience sexual violence, physical violence, stalking. Think about it. These statistics, and there are lots of different statistics that depend on exactly how you ask the question, but they are all unreasonably high. And they tell you that when you look around at us, whether you are a journalist, an aide, those beautiful children over there, us serving in Congress, you will be somebody or know somebody who has suffered from sexual assault and domestic violence. And imagine the home. The home is where you're supposed to feel safe, where you're supposed to nurture your children, where you are supposed to grow the memories, feed the food of love to your family. Imagine when it becomes the terror and the jail cell that has been described today in such a vivid form by Representative Dingell and by so many more. I represent a beautifully huge district, including Roswell, New Mexico. And in Roswell, New Mexico, we have one of the best CASA programs, the Court-Appointed Special Advocates. I need to tell you, if anybody wants to know more about what a great CASA program looks like, go down to Roswell. They have great sort of like lots of Martian stuff too. It's hilarious. But the part that isn't hilarious is the work that has been doing that they are doing to save children's lives, to prosecute those who engage in violence, and to assist the law enforcement officers as they themselves go through the trauma of day after day responding to these calls and seeing the horror that should never occur to these small children. I'm going to use the name Josie to keep Josie's name private. She had to flee multiple instances of domestic violence. She used every bit of savings that she had tucked away because she knew this day was coming. And she was able to pay half her rent. If it wouldn't have been for SNAP and WIC and programs like that, she would have not been able to leave her abusive partner. And then a month later, she didn't have the money for the rent when it came due again. But it's programs like CASA, with their big heart and their ability to get the funds, to get the federal funds, to raise the money from generous individuals that helped pay her rent, that kept her out of the cycle of returning to an abusive partner, because women will do that because they feel they have nowhere else to go. That beautiful CASA, like so many other programs that we know across this country, that we have visited across this country, are facing funding shortfalls. They are terrified that they will not be able to offer the services, the need, the lifeline that those families need to come out of that home that is no longer a home but is really a torture chamber. And that is why we all join together in a bipartisan way. We will be having the roundtable later today in a bipartisan way. That's why we all join to say, ya no, ya basta. No queremos esta violencia, ya no. Ya basta. Let's bring an end to domestic violence, but let's do it with the kind of heart and kindness and compassion that we know is in Republican, Democrat, Independent, in all hearts of those who care for the dignity of women and children, and indeed of many men who are also so often abused. And so with that, I want to recognize another member of our executive committee of the Democratic Women's Caucus, Miss Representative Ross from the wonderful state of North Carolina.
Thank you, Teresa, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today to address this really important subject for our families and for our country. I got my start working on domestic violence issues in the state legislature, and it was the women in a bipartisan way insisting on a study committee on domestic violence. Democrats and Republicans coming together, and 20 years ago we completely rewrote North Carolina's domestic violence laws. But there is so much more to do. In the United States, more than 1 in 3 women experience rape, physical violence or stalking from an intimate partner in their lifetimes. In my home state of North Carolina, we saw a shocking 69% increase in domestic violence homicides between 2018 and 2024. These numbers are unacceptable, and Congress has a duty to take action to stem the tide of violence and protect women and girls in America. During the Biden administration, we made major progress through reauthorization of the Bipartisan Violence Against Women Act. I made sure that my bipartisan bill supporting Access to Nurse Exams Act was included in this legislation to address the nationwide shortage of sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANE nurses. These specialized nurses are trained to provide comprehensive medical and emotional care to survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And they're also equipped to collect evidence of crimes. They're key to accessing justice for survivors. We owe it to women and girls who have endured unspeakable trauma to ensure that they receive the care and support they need to get out of bad situations and to seek justice in court, whether that's criminal court or getting a domestic violence protective order, which could be life-saving. That's why it is shameful that Donald Trump and his administration are circulating proposals to reduce resources for victims of domestic violence at local shelters that provide indispensable care to survivors. Nearly every federal employee within the CDC's Division of Violence Prevention has been fired. The White House budget proposes eliminating the team tackling rape prevention and education. The Office of Violence Against Women has removed all open notices for funding opportunities. Supporting victims of domestic violence has historically been a bipartisan effort, and all of us standing here are committed to ensuring that it stays that way. When I travel around my district, I consistently hear from my constituents about how concerned and angry they are by these shocking cuts to resources for survivors. But despite these attacks, we must maintain the moral courage to stand up for women and girls and men who have endured these heinous crimes. Thank you again for being here, and now I will turn it over to Congressman Jim Costa from California.
Okay, classmate. We got men on our side.
Thank you, Deborah, for those comments, and for all the colleagues of mine who are here this morning, who speak with authority, with passion, and their own experiences, as you've heard from their statements. I, too, am honored to be a part of this working group against domestic violence, because ensuring that those who experience domestic violence, we know, need our support, resources, and the dignity that they deserve. For domestic violence knows no political boundaries. It knows no gender boundaries. And therefore, our support for these efforts are not a luxury, but they are support that these individuals and these families, because oftentimes it's families that experience this domestic violence, it's a lifeline. It's a lifeline. Cuts to these programs, as my colleagues have stated, is not just a few numbers on a spreadsheet. It means real consequences. I've seen these. It means fewer shelter beds, longer wait lists for counseling, and therefore more survivors that are left in danger. As a co-chair and co-founder with my colleague, Congressman Ted Poe, in 2005, we founded the Bipartisan Crime Survivors and Justice Caucus. We did so out of his experience as a judge in Texas and my experience in California. I've long, like my colleagues here, supported the Violence Against Women's Act, signed into law in 1994, and have tried to protect that funding. Victims of child abuse and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act are there because colleagues like myself and others who are here believe that survivors deserve more than just a few words, but they deserve action. Now, I suspect I share with my colleagues here interactions with local organizations. As was noted before, the court-appointed special advocates, CASA. CASA does incredible work throughout the country. I know I've seen it in the San Joaquin Valley with CASA organizations that I've worked with and supported. The Marjorie Mason Center in Fresno has been a shelter, a bastion for support, primarily for women and children for decades, and they have been recognized and honored as such, as well as other efforts in my area, like the Fresno Economic Opportunities Commission, that are on the front lines, helping survivors navigate trauma, dealing with mental health, counseling, and medical care, all critical needs for those who are victims of domestic violence. And yes, we've all heard stories of police departments where they get that call at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, going to a home in which, in some instances, there is already a history of domestic violence. And in some cases, restraining orders. And while restraining orders are helpful and can be important, how many women and children have been killed or injured notwithstanding those restraining orders? And therefore, more needs to be done. And we're trying. But it's difficult because we're being asked to do more with less, as my colleagues noted. Due to the federal funding cuts and delays, these organizations that I have in my area and my colleagues have in their area are seeing declining resources at a time when demand for those services is increasing. And this big, whatever you want to call it, but it's not beautiful, this Reconciliation Act is not going to help, and in fact it's going to hurt those who are most in need. And therefore Congress and my colleagues, we called today this working group against efforts to deal with domestic violence, because efforts to reduce funding is just wrong. It's just wrong. It's going in the wrong direction. So I stand here with, like my colleagues, victims of domestic violence, their survivors, and let me once again say their families. Families, because they're all a part of this horrific set of circumstances they experience. And we all have our personal experience, and my friend Debbie Dingell, with such great clarity and passion, talked about her own situation, but we all have stories and experiences to share. And so therefore today I am honored to be here with these strong group of individuals who I respect and who I work with. I stand with our survivors, and I stand with the advocates throughout the country who care every day and who are reaching out every day to make a difference. And we will continue to fight in Congress to ensure that no survivor and their families are ever left behind, regardless of their gender, regardless of their socio-economic being, regardless of where they live in America. Because this is a critical need. So I am honored to introduce our colleague, Representative Sykes from Akron, Ohio, who has had a long history of fighting the good fight and has her own experiences and passion to share with us. And we're honored that we get a chance to work together every day. Congresswoman Sykes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here and standing here in this very warm weather, but this is an important conversation, and I'm so glad that we get to have it. I'm Congresswoman Amelia Sykes. I represent Ohio's 13th Congressional District, and I want to thank all of you for being here and the National Task Force to End Domestic Violence for making sure that we have and they organize this day of action. They have been fighting for decades for the right, safety, and dignity of survivors, and I appreciate them and thank them for all of their work. And mostly, I want to say thank you to my colleagues who stand with me, some who are here, some who are not, because we have a lot of work to do to make sure that every single woman, man, and child in this community feels safe and sound no matter where they live. We are here to sound the alarm. That's why we're here today, because across the country, survivors are being left behind, and the very programs that are supposed to help them are under attack. Federal grant programs are the lifeblood of domestic violence services. These funds help shelters stay open, support trauma counseling, legal assistance, child advocacy, and crisis intervention. But the day since this Trump administration has been in office, they have threatened all of these services. For example, the Office on Violence Against Women removed all open funding notices from its website. It's been 3 months, shuttering the annual grant cycle and creating chaos for the service providers who depend on a predictable timeline. The DOJ has already revoked or canceled hundreds of grants across the country, leaving programs stranded, reduced staff, and having to turn survivors away from services that they need. And while some of these decisions have been walked back, the chilling effects remain. Providers are now operating in a fog of chaos, concern, and consternation, the very sensations that they are working so tirelessly to provide assistance for. And it's not just the current funding that's under threat. The entire vision of survivor services is being rewritten in support of perpetrators and abusers. Entire categories of activities, including those that speak about domestic violence as a social justice issue, are now ineligible for funding. This is an outrageous political intrusion into life-saving work, and it must be stopped. In my own district, we know the power of well-supported local domestic violence leadership. Across the district, we have women and men who have dedicated their lives who are calling me saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to help these survivors? In a recent report, it was shown that domestic violence costs $1.2 billion last year. Reduced productivity, medical expenses, social services. And I know some of my colleagues only like to talk dollar and cents rather than the lives of the people who are impacted, but we don't have extra $1.2 billion to give away because of domestic violence. We are working and fighting for an infrastructure that can live on forever. And so today's day of action is not just about preserving funding, it's about protecting the entire network and demanding that survivors of all backgrounds are not excluded or erased in our response to violence. That's why in Congress I've been working on expanding protections for survivors, giving them the economic tools that they need to get by, to get out of these scenarios. When I was the minority leader in the House of Representatives, we modernized our domestic violence statute so that more people could get protections and that we did not see so many victims, and we helped them before they even be a part of the awful cycle of abuse. Now we must double down and ensure that this work continues, because our communities cannot afford what Donald Trump is providing for families and women who are simply just trying to live safely and securely in homes. And as we face these attacks on domestic violence services, I know that everyone who's standing with me today is continuing to work against this, but we need more. This is not going to be something that we can do alone. This is, as I say often, democracy is a group project. And everyone, all of their friends, all of their neighbors, anyone who is concerned, and 1 in 3 women are impacted. So everybody knows someone if it is not you. We need you. And we're asking you for you to join in with us to make sure that this administration is listening to the pleas and the calls of women and families and children who need this service. It's not just a want or a desire. They need this service to survive, and we will be standing with them every step of the way. So I just want to again say thank you to everyone for participating in this day of action. Let's not make this day of action a single day. We will continue this until this funding is restored. And I'm now going to turn the program back over to our wonderful leaders, Congresswoman Dingell and more. And thank you both for your steadfast work on protecting victims.
Any questions? Thank you.
Very good. Your voice is important.
And just, lifting up the fact that that rape was a really great issue in the military for women, that it is not just out here in civilian life that's a problem.
No, correct.
I used to be the officer in charge of the Family Advocacy Board at NAS Oceana, Virginia, and so I got to hear a lot of sad stories. And I also got to hear a lot of excuses being made for the perpetrators.
And we are very concerned about the fact that there are, in terms of the issues for veterans and for women in the military, there has been a particularly negative focus, a particularly destructive focus on women in the military and also the women veterans. So we'd love to follow up with you. Right behind you is Daniela. She is the policy director for the Democratic Women's Caucus. Please have a conversation with her. We encourage everybody to follow the Democratic Women's Caucus. It's Democratic Women's Caucus. We write letters, we assist others who are doing great work. This is the task force work, but we do a lot of stuff, and we do have a task force dedicated to veterans and with some of our colleagues who are veterans themselves. And so Daniela will connect you.
Okay.
Thank you.
With that,
Thank you
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.